It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce my colleague Bob Keiter, who will be our next speaker. Bob is a university professor at the University of Utah, which is one of the highest honors that the university gives. He's also the Wallace Stegner Professor of Law at the College of Law, and he is the director of the Wallace Stegner Center, and he is going to be speaking on growing the national park system. Thank you.
I always tell my colleagues, if you're going to organize a symposium, make sure you leave a spot for yourself. So I guess I'm living up to that. I really appreciate everyone sticking around for the last segment of the symposium. I hope that it's made some sense as it's unfolded. And I want to carry forward the question that Denny was addressing, and that's the question of opportunities to grow the system, and in particular to address the question of whether there may be some more Yellowstones out there in one form or another. And I'll get into that as I move forward. I probably should add, oops, do this correctly. I should add that much of this presentation stems from the penultimate chapter in my book, To Conserve Unimpaired. So we've heard how important the national park idea is and has been during the past century, and we've heard how the idea has changed and evolved over time. These changes are in part a reflection of the growth of the national park system, which today totals 401 units. And this map gives you a sense of where they are. And I'll return to that question in a second. So as the question that I asked myself in writing the book and in thinking about this, and also I should add as serving on the subcommittee on landscape conservation for the National Park Service Advisory Board that addressed this question of expansion of the national park system as well as large landscape conservation is this all? Is the national park system essentially complete? Are there opportunities out there for growth? And if so, what are they and what factors should we be focusing on? And recognizing that it's a challenge politically, and I don't think anyone denies that, I ask a second question, and that is alternatively. Are there other opportunities to expand or at least safeguard the national park system to ensure that it's able to accomplish its natural and cultural conservation goals? And this is a question, as I'll suggest in a moment, that is particularly relevant today given the array of pressures that our national parks are facing from an ever more crowded landscape. So important point here, I think, is, and it's been made before, note where most of the green is in the west. Nonetheless, there are some significant park units on the East Coast as well. And of course, Alaska lurks over here. More to say about that in a moment. So what's the history of the evolution of the American National Park System? And you don't necessarily need to read this. I'll have some slides that illustrate a couple of points. I tried to highlight some of the key periods or events where we saw significant growth in the system. A couple of points that are worth noting. One, it's been pretty haphazard. If you take a look at how the system has evolved and changed over the last, pretty much the last, well, more than the last century, for that matter. That evolution begins with Yellowstone, as we've seen. It continues both with large parks, beginning in 1906 with adoption of the Antiquities Act, the designation of national monuments by presidents that essentially bypasses Congress to at least protect an area until Congress has an opportunity to bring it into the system, if it is so, that is by formal designation, if it is so inclined. And then as the system moves forward, you'll notice that our idea of what a national park is begins to change to the rock and ice, the large scenic lands, western mountains, eastern mountains too, give way to new types of parks. The Everglades National Park, for example, in South Florida, not one of these scenic monumental landscapes, but still a stunning landscape, also protected, as we heard yesterday, as wilderness in the designating legislation. Worth noting also that Congress authorizes the park in 1934. It doesn't finally come into the system through until 1947. And then, of course, we have the additions that occurred in 1980 with adoption of the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act that more than doubled the size of the national park system. That's a signal event in the evolution and history of the system. It's also, I think, relevant for the fact that since 1980, we've really seen just scattered additions to the national park system. There have not been a lot of major additional designations. There are a few exceptions. California desert legislation, 1994. Great Basin comes in subsequently, but not a large number of large national parks. And of course, that's going to be my focus for this presentation. Our thinking was that Denny would cover the smaller units and the different types of designations that you see east, pretty much on the eastern side of the continent. So the other important development in the evolution of the system, beginning with the designation of the Boulder National Recreation Area, subsequently renamed the Lake Mead National Recreation Area, Congress begins coming forth with a variety of different designations. There's well over a dozen designations today. I simply illustrate some of them here. National seashores, national lake shores, national preserves. They are within the national park system, but managed under different standards. Generally not quite as rigorous as the 59 major natural national parks. As we think about expansion of the national park system, it's important to think about, well, what's happened on the landscape over time. And the important points here are that it's changed. As reflected here, exurban development and is frequent in many instances encroaching on national park boundaries, where 20, 30, 50 years ago there may well not have been any settlement adjacent to a national park. Industrial activity occurring on adjacent lands. This is the western boundary of Yellowstone National Park. The park itself is here. The snow that you see on this side of the boundary line, which is a straight line, obviously of little ecological value, reflects the clear-cutting activity that occurred in the Targhee National Forest during the 1960s and 1970s. And then, of course, even further afield, changes that are impacting the national parks, as we've already heard about in several presentations. Climate change, the slide reflects the evolution of this glacier in Glacier National Park. And again, we've heard about this previously. I won't dwell on it, but our society continues to change, to grow more diverse. The graph here, a little bit hard to see perhaps. The gray here reflects the projections of the white population in our nation going forward to 2060, or 2050, excuse me. Interestingly, the pink in this box reflects growth of the Hispanic population projected forward, and other minority populations reflected at the top. The map here shows where we live. roughly, as noted before, 80% of us living in these blue areas are large and growing metropolitan communities, cities, urban living, and the nature deficit disorder concept. Can you read the cartoon? No. Okay. The mother ushering the child out says, see, this is called the outdoors. The child responds, oh, I've seen this level on my video game. Again, taking a historic look at this, as early as shortly after adoption of the National Park Service Organic Act, the Secretary of the Interior, Franklin Lane, issued what's become known in Park Service lore as the Lane Letter in 1918, describing his view. And actually, the historians tell us it was a combination of Horace Albright and Stephen Mather's view of how the national parks ought to be managed. And in the course of that Lane letter, Secretary Lane says that in studying new park projects, you've got to find extraordinary or unique landscape places of national interest and importance that don't lower the standard, dignity, prestige of the system. In essence, establishing what continues to today to be regarded as a national significance standard for addition of lands into the national park system. So what next in thinking about the future? And I'll, again, not necessary to read this. I'll be running through each of the points made on the slide. First and foremost, as we've heard in several presentations, we ought to be taking science into account as we think about potential growth in the system and potential opportunities for growth. Why take science seriously? It was not taken seriously initially within our national park system. The early parks, as you've heard, were primarily designated for their scenic qualities, their monumental characteristics, and the Park Service managed basically a static scene. Attempting to preserve what was there to begin with, to have places that looked really nice, were really green, and all of that without necessarily taking into account what the ecological processes might be that were occurring on the landscape. This began to change in the 1930s with George Melendez-Wright and the faunal study reports that he provided to the agency as a result of, one, his tragic death, and two, the Great Depression, as well as the Second World War. Our focus really moved away from national parks and domestic concerns to international concerns. And it's not until the 1960s that we returned to this question with the making of both the Leopold report, mentioned several times here, and a companion report from the National Academy of Sciences that was issued in the same year, both of which reached a basic conclusion that the Park Service ought to be relying more upon science in its management of these units. It takes, that marks a substantial change in the management, resource management within the agency, but it's not until the late the early 90s that there's more movement afoot to really fully institutionalize this with the idea of taking science seriously within the National Park Service, with the publication of Richard West Sellers' book, Preserving Nature in National Parks. We see the Park Service issue a Natural Resource Challenge, and ultimately Congress adopt in 1998 to add science explicitly in the law to the National Park Service's management responsibility, to its Organic Act. As I mentioned, with the coming of science of age, beginning to think about how we might approach growth of the system from an ecological perspective. This map simply gives you a sense of designations of different ecological regions within the United States. The different colors represent different types of ecologies and regions. The important point here is how diverse these different regions are. And if you think back to my earlier slide of the national park system, there's not a lot of congruence between where our park units are located and these different eco-regions. Ecologists tell us that moving forward, we ought to be thinking for purposes both of biological diversity conservation, for purposes of addressing climate change, to take into account the 4 R's in any expansion or growth of our protected land system, and to ensure adequate representation, lacking, I suggest here, redundancy to guard against catastrophic events, resiliency to respond to significant changes on the landscape, and looking for opportunities to restore landscapes in order to address conservation objectives. So, what are some of the strategies that might be out there taking science into account and thinking also strategically? These slides all represent proposals that are afoot within local communities, conservation organizations. A couple of these proposals have actually even been translated into legislation that's been introduced into Congress. And as you can see, there are ideas and proposals for significant new additions to the national park system. Most of these would indeed come out of existing federal lands managed by other agencies. That would not be the case in Maine, I should add. But nonetheless, you get a sense that there are potential opportunities out there. The big question, I think, in terms of moving forward with any of these opportunities is there the political will, particularly locally, to lift the proposal up to the point of passage within Congress. And of course, lurking in the background, at least with respect to the federal lands, is the President's Antiquities Act authority. As we think about moving forward in terms of designation of new parks, potential designation, I should also point out that in 1976, Congress took the concept found in the Lane letter and put it into legislation. And we now have a mandate that, at least insofar as the agencies go, the Park Service, the Interior Department, as they contemplate new additions to the system, they have to take into account the national significance of the area, as well as its suitability and feasibility for addition to the system. So that's something to be taken into consideration as we think about potential opportunities for going forward. In 1998, the legislation that added the science mandate also provided a laundry list of considerations, factors that ought to go into the determination by Interior and the Park Service as to whether a unit is worthy of addition to the system. If you look through this litany of factors, it seems to me that at the end of the day, this national significance concept as an overarching concept is a little bit like beauty. It's a little bit like due process, if I can refer to my constitutional law heritage. It's a little bit like what one wants to make of it. And that these factors are broad enough that all of the areas that I pointed out earlier merit consideration, and these factors would also and could and should take into account the 4 R's. Other opportunities for growth or protection of the national park system to enhance conservation, expansion of boundaries, something that has occurred regularly with respect to many of our national parks. The diagrams on the board reflect additions to petrified forest, National Park in Arizona. This diagram reflects the evolution of Capitol Reef National Park and its gradual growth. Other examples of boundary expansions, 1994 California Desert Protection Act, the darker green areas, I'm sorry that it's not any clearer on the slide, were added to Death Valley National Park. The net effect of that, and as you can see, it grows the park considerably. The net effect of that is that Death Valley National Park is now has now surpassed Yellowstone as the largest national park in the lower 48. And I include here a proposal that has been alluded to previously. This is Canyonlands National Park here in our own state of Utah as designated by Congress. There have been a series of proposals for it's phrased differently, expansion, completion of Canyonlands National Park, or the designation of a Greater Canyonlands National Monument. This particular slide shows the basic boundaries that have been suggested in conjunction with Canyonlands completion, an idea that surfaced about 20 years ago, 20 plus years ago when Walt Dabney was superintendent of Canyonlands. It would represent a significant expansion of the park in order to build it out to the rim, to make it a topographical unit so that it wasn't chopped in half by the geology of the area. Beyond park expansion, we also can think about other ways to protect lands near or surrounding national parks. And this is a slide I think that's particularly illustrative. Here we have Grand Canyon National Park in this pink color, sort of serpentine along the Colorado River. Notice here we have a designation, let me make sure I'm pointing to the right place, of the Grand Canyon Parashant National Monument by President Clinton in 1999, if I'm remembering the year correctly, which as a practical matter, although the land does not change hands, it remains under the management of the Bureau of Land Management, significantly expands basically the protected areas surrounding on this flank of Canyonlands. At the same time, or near the same time, President Clinton designates the Vermilion Cliffs National Monument up here at the northern end of the park, again adding to the protected landscape of the area. And if you look more broadly around the Grand Canyon National Park, you've got national forests here that are managed in a relatively protected status. And as you move up the Colorado River, you begin to have additional protected lands. And as a practical matter, a lot of this landscape here throughout this stretch of the Colorado River is under some sort of protected status, which, as a practical matter, significantly expands the reach of the protected areas there. An additional illustration of that, again during the Clinton administration, the addition of Giant Sequoia National Monument on the flanks of Sequoia National Park, extending protection to parts of the national forest landscapes on a couple of flanks of the Sequoia Kings Canyon. And then we've seen slides of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem previously. If I can highlight, here you have the Yellowstone itself, the John D. Rockefeller Parkway area, and then Grand Teton National Park here. Both of these parks are basically surrounded by national forest lands, beginning back with passage of the Wilderness Act and carrying up through the 1980s. Notice in the dark green area how much of the national forest lands on the immediately adjacent to the park have been designated wilderness. The practical effect of that is to expand conservation type protections out dramatically. on several flanks of Yellowstone National Park. I should also note that here on the Targhee National Forest, I showed the slide earlier, there is an active proposal that is being addressed within the local community and at a statewide level to designate a national monument. And some of the talk at the moment is a national monument approaching 1 million acres. It remains to be seen whether that proposal ultimately has legs. If it were to have legs, again, sort of thinking piecemeal of how protected areas have gradually begun to rim a good bit of the landscape around Yellowstone National Park without necessarily any change in ownership or management on these federal lands. Beginning probably in the early 80s, although one can actually trace these concepts back much earlier than that, the idea of ecosystem scale management begins to surface. And it surfaces in response to a number of things, one of which is a report done by the National Park Service in 1980 that the national parks are under siege, basically, that they're threatened by developments and activities beyond their borders. This is the best copy I could come up with of the report itself, called State of the Parks, in the 1980s. Over here is a scientific paper that got quite a bit of attention during that same period of time by William Newmark, a scientist at our own Utah Museum of Natural History, who studied extinctions within national parks and concluded that there had been a number of extinctions over the last century in I believe it's the Western National Parks, as a result of boundaries not being sufficient to provide adequate protection. All of this begins to come together through a whole series of reports that recognize that the parks themselves simply don't provide adequate protection, that they are islands or enclaves, if you will. As early as 1917, this quote, "Give her Greater Yellowstone and she will inevitably become Greater Wyoming," meant to endorse a proposal to expand Yellowstone National Park, actually backfired on Emerson Howe when he wrote it at that point in time. But the thinking nonetheless was of park expansion for conservation purposes. 34, discussion about the need for buffer areas because of pressures from outside the park. The Leopold report itself talks about parks as ecological islands. And then in the early 1990s, the Vail Agenda is speaking explicitly about external and transboundary impairment of park resources, all giving way to the concept that we need to manage on a larger scale, ecosystem scale, for conservation. And there have been a number of initiatives where national parks have been front and foremost to attempt to do that, some with more success than others. I already alluded to the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Beginning again in the 1980s, the concept of a Greater Yellowstone ecosystem took hold, that this area ought to be managed as a whole, at least on the federal lands. A proposal that ultimately surfaced as a vision document to do just that between the National Park Service and the National Forest Service was produced by an interagency committee. It ultimately failed on the shoals of local politics, but nonetheless this idea continues to move forward with piecemeal protections being added at the perimeter of the park, as I alluded to earlier. And the Greater Yellowstone Coordinating Committee continues to be a ongoing entity with more or less interest in managing this in a more coordinated fashion. Certainly they deal in a coordinated fashion with individual issues. Think grizzly bears, wolves, and bison, and fires, I should add. This is a Crown of the Continent ecosystem, Glacier National Park right here. Its sister park, Waterton Lakes in Canada. And you have substantial wilderness areas adjacent to a good bit of a glacier. an undeveloped area in the North Fork of the Flathead just to the northwest of Glacier. There are significant efforts afoot through a Crown Managers Partnership to seek to manage this in a more holistic, coordinated fashion. The jury is out, but this particular area, Crown of the Continent ecosystem, has gotten a good deal of attention by the current administration as a demonstration project under its America's Great Outdoors initiative. And then, of course, the Comprehensive Ecosystem Restoration Initiative in South Florida that seeks, through reversal of the dams, diversions, and dikes and canals that occurred in the middle part of the 20th century to restore this sheet of water that flowed from Lake Okeechobee down to the Everglades and really was responsible for giving the Everglades its ecological character. And you can see the goal of restoring the flow, and there continues to be progress in achieving that, albeit slow, and it is a significant coordination effort at the federal and the state level. Moving beyond the ecosystem level to landscape level, this slide illustrates the northern Rockies region, and we expand the scale out of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem to look at this, begin looking at this area as a whole, the crown of the continent. You also have the salmon selway wilderness areas in Idaho here, and the question is, are there opportunities to begin to link together these three ecosystems at this landscape scale? The number of conservation groups, including the Greater Yellowstone Coalition, are focused on opportunities to connect out from the west of Yellowstone National Park through the Centennials and to ultimately hook up with the central Idaho wilderness areas in order to facilitate movement of carnivores and grizzly bears and other large animals. And hopefully, at the end of the day, to connect up with the grizzly bear population in the crown of the continent. There also are an interest and some possibilities of connection coming straight down. Thinking about managing at a larger scale, of course, the Park Service is not in a position to do it itself. It involves many neighbors. I've talked about other federal agencies, particularly here in the West. There are Native American reservations that often are adjacent to or proximate to national park areas. This is a picture of Badlands National Park. And I don't have time to go into all of the details, but there is a proposal endorsed by the National Park Service in its recently released General Management Plan to create the first tribal national park that would essentially have the Oglala Sioux taking over day-to-day management of the South Unit of Badlands National Park. If it comes to fruition, it would represent another success story in terms of collaboration between the Park Service and its neighbors. Wildlife corridors have been mentioned. Jody Hilty went into this at some length, and this is an illustration of the path of the pronghorn corridor. Again, in the interest of time, I won't go through this in detail, but it involves multiple players to bring this to fruition. The National Park Service itself here is the summer range for the pronghorn, a designated corridor in the National Forest Management Plan, the first so designated wildlife corridor on a national forest. Land trust acquisitions, conservation easements to remove fences through this strip of private land up north of Pinedale, Wyoming. The overpasses alluded to yesterday, and then the ACEC designations in the BLM lands. Those of you familiar with the landscape know there's major oil and gas activity occurring throughout all of this area that has hastened the movement toward the wildlife corridor concept. I'd suggest that the National Trail Act provides a potential model for how we might think in the long term of actual national wildlife corridor legislation at the federal level. It also occurred to me as we think about potential for expansion of the park system that, as also alluded to earlier, several of our eastern and western national parks, for that matter, were designated on lands that were in bad shape, that needed to be restored, and Shenandoah is an example of that. You see what it looks like today. My question is, can't we think about perhaps a new designation by Congress at the federal level of national restoration areas, with the goal of taking some landscapes that are in bad shape and rehabilitating them, restoring them in a sort of two-step process that at the second level would end up in a conservation designation, perhaps a national park designation. New urban-based parks, we've heard quite a bit about that. I won't dwell on that concept, but certainly the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area gives us a model of how we might think about urban parks in our urban communities for all of the reasons that we've talked about before. Finally, in thinking about the future, what the national park system might look like, a proposal that comes out of the 2012 National Park Service Advisory Board report that arose in this committee that I and Jody Hilty and Denny Galvin served on with Gretchen Long, suggested that Congress might consider adopting a new national conservation network law. The slide shows you in green the already protected lands, at least in the western part of the United States. The red shows you roadless, basically roadless BLM lands. Some of those ultimately will be protected in one form or another. And given that, and given the tremendous conservation values that we attach and we continue to think are more and more important as our society matures, might we think about, if you will, sort of throwing a network designation around all of these lands and begin to tell the agencies to think about managing them in a more coordinated fashion. I'm not suggesting changing ownership or management responsibility there, but it does seem to me that we've created a national park system, a wilderness system, a national landscape conservation system, a national wildlife refuge system. Doesn't it make sense to think in terms of bringing all of those under an umbrella, to regard them collectively as a national conservation network or something like that? Terminology isn't as important as the idea. In the end, if we should be thinking in terms of not only the National Park Service, but all of us interested in conservation, of opportunities to pursue new designations and authorities to support large land-scale conservation. Thank you very much.